As the Third Reich collapsed, the spotlight turned to the men who led it. But behind them were their wives who lived in stolen mansions and toasted victories while Europe bled. Now, with defeat closing in, they had nowhere left to run. Their husbands were dead or captured. What followed were suicides, arrests, interrogations, and total destruction. Their last hours were as brutal as the regime they once served. By the last week of April 1945, Berlin was in complete chaos. The Red Army had pushed deep into the city. Artillery shells hit buildings every few minutes, and the sky was constantly filled with smoke. Whole neighborhoods were destroyed. Water, electricity, and food were nearly gone. German civilians were either hiding in basements or trying to escape, but there was no safe place left. In the center of Berlin, below the garden of the Reich Chancellery, was the Führer bunker. This underground shelter was where Adolf Hitler and his closest followers had taken refuge. The bunker was built to survive bombs, with thick walls and narrow hallways. It was divided into small rooms and offices, lit by dim lamps. The air was damp and filled with cigarette smoke. Everyone inside knew the end was near. Adolf Hitler stayed in the lower part of the bunker. His behavior had become more unstable. He rarely slept, shouted at generals, and received reports that made it clear Germany had lost the war. The mood among his staff was tense. People whispered in corners, and fear grew with every sound from above. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in a short ceremony inside the bunker. Eva had been with him for many years, but mostly stayed away from the public during the war. The wedding was witnessed by a few aides, including Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. That same night, Hitler dictated his final will. He refused to surrender. He blamed Germany's defeat on betrayal by his own officers and said he would not be taken alive. The next afternoon, on April 30th, Hitler and Eva went into his private study. Eva swallowed a cyanide capsule. Hitler then shot himself in the right temple with a pistol. Their bodies were discovered soon after by his aides. Following his orders, the bodies were wrapped in blankets, carried outside into the garden, and burned using gasoline. The Soviets were already just meters away, and the smell of gunpowder was thick in the air. But the horror didn't end there. Magda Goebbels, wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, was also in the bunker. She had arrived weeks earlier with all 6 of her children. The children were between 4 and 12 years old. Magda had always shown strong loyalty to Hitler. She believed that life after him would not be worth living, for her or for her children. Even as Berlin collapsed above them, Magda kept her children clean and dressed them neatly every day. She tried to create a sense of calm, even though they were surrounded by fear. Some of the bunker staff grew close to the children and played with them, but everyone knew what was likely coming. On the evening of May 1st, 1945, Magda and Josef made their final decision. With the help of Hitler's personal physician, SS Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, the children were first given sleeping medication. Once they were unconscious, Magda placed a cyanide capsule in each child's mouth and crushed it. All 6 children died in their beds, lying beside each other in the bunker's small sleeping quarters. Later that night, Josef and Magda walked up to the garden. Josef shot his wife in the head and then turned the gun on himself. Their bodies were found by bunker staff and quickly burned near the same spot where Hitler and Eva Braun had been cremated the day before. By now, Soviet troops were just steps ahead. The sounds of tanks and gunfire were so close that the bunker walls shook. Wilhelmstrasse, the main street outside, was filled with destroyed vehicles and rubble. The few people still in the bunker had no contact with the outside world. Phones no longer worked, and radios were silent. Supplies were running out. Food was scarce. The air was hard to breathe. Some officers talked about trying to escape, while others waited in silence. Many had already taken cyanide or shot themselves. The bunker once built to protect Germany's leaders had become a tomb. Above ground, Soviet forces raised their flag over the Reichstag building on May 2nd, marking the symbolic fall of Berlin. By then, most of Hitler's inner circle was dead, missing or captured. As the news spread, suicides and escapes began increasing across the country among generals, SS officers, and also among their wives. One of the most well-known wives, Lina Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, the high-ranking SS officer who was assassinated in 1942 in Prague, was living in southern Germany. Since her husband's death, she had received government money, owned a house in Fichten, and had strong political connections. But by May 1945, everything had changed. Lina feared that the Czech resistance, which had already punished Nazi collaborators, would come after her. She also worried about Soviet forces moving into the region. Rather than escape the country, Lina destroyed many private papers, letters, and files linked to her husband's work with the SS and the Gestapo. She then took her children and fled to the northern island of Fehmarn, where she tried to stay out of sight. In the port city of Kiel, Germany's remaining naval leadership was breaking apart. On May 3, 1945, General Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, the commander of the Kriegsmarine, under Admiral Karl Donitz, formally surrendered the German Navy to British forces. The news spread quickly, and just hours after the surrender, his wife, whose name was never officially recorded in public documents, took her own life. The exact method is unknown, but it was confirmed by British officers present in the area. She simply could not live with the reality that her husband's military command and their entire world was over. 20 days later, on May 23rd, Friedeburg himself died by suicide after learning he would be handed over to Allied war crimes investigators. In Stendal, a town northeast of Magdeburg, American troops arrested Margareta Speer, the wife of Albert Speer, who had been Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production. She was not harmed or charged, but because her husband had held such a central role in the Nazi government, the arrest was serious. U.S. forces quickly separated her from her children, searched her home, and brought her in for long questioning sessions. They wanted to know everything she had seen or heard during her husband's work. Margareta stayed silent during most of it. She didn't kill herself, but her life changed completely from that moment on. All over Germany, scenes like this repeated. In towns like Demmin, Neustrelitz, and some parts of Berlin, thousands of civilians took their own lives. In Demmin alone, around 900 people, mostly women and children, died in just a few days. Some drowned themselves in the Peene River. Others used poison, knives, or even fire. These were not all high-ranking Nazis, but many had ties to the regime or simply feared the arrival of Soviet soldiers. Rumors spread quickly about violence, looting, and revenge killings by Red Army troops. For many women, suicide seemed like the only escape. Among the wives of Nazi officers, suicide was seen not only as a way to avoid punishment, but as a way to stay loyal. Some believed they had failed Hitler and the Reich. Others had supported Nazi ideas so strongly that life under Allied occupation seemed unbearable. In their minds, surrender meant disgrace. Facing trial meant public shame. Being tied to the Nazi elite, even just as a wife, was enough to end a person's life and reputation. In some cases, wives begged their husbands to kill them. In others, they acted alone. In towns where the SS had ruled for years, whole families died together. By the end of the first week of May, Germany had become a country full of mass graves, not only from bombing or combat, but also from suicide. Each grave told a different story. Some were about guilt, some were about fear, and others were about blind loyalty to a government that had already collapsed. After Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended, but the search for justice had only just begun. The Allied powers launched a wide hunt for former Nazi officials, SS officers, and their families. Many high-ranking Nazis were already dead or had gone into hiding, but their wives, who had often lived in luxury during the war, were still in Europe, many of them in remote homes, castles, or even mountain villages. Allied investigators believed these women could help uncover hidden details about the Nazi regime. Some of them had been deeply involved in Nazi society. Others were suspected of helping their husbands, hiding documents, or benefiting from stolen property. Even if they hadn't committed direct crimes, the Allies saw many of them as important witnesses. One of the first arrests was Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, who had been Hitler's deputy before flying to Scotland in 1941 to try and make peace. The mission failed, and Rudolf Hess spent the rest of the war as a British prisoner. But Ilse remained in Germany and stayed close to Nazi circles. She attended meetings, supported Nazi charities, and kept writing to her husband in prison. In late May 1945, U.S. troops found her in southern Bavaria and arrested her. Though she wasn't accused of war crimes, Allied officers believed she had never stopped supporting Nazi ideas. After her release from detention, Ilse Hess was banned from public life. She couldn't own land, publish political writings, or speak at events. Her children were also monitored closely. In June 1945, Allied soldiers captured Emmy Goering, the wife of Hermann Goering, in Fischhorn Castle, located in the Austrian Alps. Emmy had lived like royalty during the war. She had worn the finest clothes, attended ceremonies next to Hitler, and stayed in mansions full of expensive art and furniture. After her arrest, her husband surrendered soon after and was sent to stand trial at Nuremberg. Emmy was taken to a detention center and separated from her daughter, Edda, for several months. The Allies seized her belongings. People who had once treated her with great respect now ignored her or called her a criminal. When she was released in 1948, she was no longer seen as a symbol of elegance, but as a part of a terrible regime. She lived the rest of her life quietly in Munich, under the eye of the government, far from the life of wealth she had once enjoyed. Another woman arrested was Elsa von Greifenberg, wife of SS General Karl Wolff. Her husband had worked closely with Himmler and helped manage communication between Hitler and the SS. In early 1945, Karl Wolff secretly made contact with American officers in Switzerland to help arrange surrender of German troops in northern Italy. These talks were part of Operation Sunrise, one of the first secret negotiations between the Nazis and the Allies. Because of this, Allied officers believed Elsa might have known key details. She was arrested in June 1945 and taken to a camp near Munich. During questioning, she claimed she had never been involved in politics and only focused on her household. But documents later showed she had attended many SS events and had personal friendships with wives of other top Nazi officers. Although she wasn't charged, she was not allowed to return to her former estate, and her property was taken by occupation forces. She withdrew from public life after her husband's release from prison in the early 1950s. Wolff had avoided execution by cooperating with the Allies during the surrender of German troops in Italy. Both he and Elsa lived quietly in Bavaria, away from politics and media attention. She passed away in the early 1970s, largely forgotten by the public. By the summer of 1945, Allied detention camps were full of women like them, wives, sisters, and daughters of Nazi leaders. These women came from all parts of Germany and Austria. Some had lived on military bases. Others had stayed in mountain retreats like Berghof, where Hitler often visited. Many of them were questioned for days about what they had seen, what they knew, and whether they had helped hide people or objects from the regime. The U.S. Army set up large internment camps in places like Augsburg, Regensburg, and Bad Nauheim, where women were processed. The French held prisoners in areas like Metz and Strasbourg. and the British used sites in Lower Saxony and northern Germany. Conditions in these camps were strict. The women had to wear plain clothes, eat basic food, and follow military orders. Some were kept in isolation. Others were held with strangers and forbidden from contacting family members. Not all of them were a part of crimes, but most had enjoyed the benefits of being close to Nazi power. Many had lived in large houses seized from Jewish families. Some had maids and servants who were prisoners. They had attended concerts and balls while the war raged across Europe. Now all of that was gone. Even those who were released after a few months faced harsh rules. They were not allowed to vote, teach, or work for the government. Some were banned from owning land or running businesses. Many couldn't even leave their home districts without permission. They were watched by the new German police or Allied forces, and their names were placed on blacklists. Former friends cut ties with them. They lost their homes, social positions, and in many cases, their children. For the wives of Nazi leaders who were captured by the Soviets, the punishment was often harsh, personal, and unforgiving. The Red Army had suffered greatly during the German invasion, and when they reached Berlin and other Nazi-held areas, many soldiers and commanders were filled with rage. They didn't just see these women as the wives of powerful men, but as symbols of everything the Nazis had done to their people. Hedwig Rosenberg, the wife of Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief ideologist, and one of the architects of racist Nazi policies, had lived in Königsberg in East Prussia when the Red Army arrived. She was captured in May 1945 and transported east beyond Poland to a Soviet prison. Her husband had already been captured by American forces, but the Soviets still wanted to break her. She was locked in a freezing prison cell, denied medical care, and barely fed. For over 2 years, she remained under surveillance. Even though she was eventually released in 1947, she had no home to return to. Königsberg had been taken over by the Soviets and renamed Kaliningrad. In many Soviet-occupied towns and villages, other women linked to the Nazi leadership faced public violence. Wives, secretaries, and even female relatives of SS officers were pulled from homes and paraded through the streets. Civilians, many of whom had lost everything in the war, took part in these acts. Some women were stripped, their hair shaved off in front of crowds. Others were punched, kicked, and spit on before being handed over to Soviet guards. These acts were not part of official military orders, but they were allowed to happen in many areas. There was no sympathy for these women. The Soviet prison didn't treat them like prisoners of war. They were seen as enemies, sometimes even more hated than the men who had already died. In the chaos of post-war Europe, their rights were ignored. Many were never officially listed in records. During the Nuremberg trials, inside the courtroom, the world saw images of concentration camps, heard about mass killings, and listened to hours of witness testimony. But just outside the courtroom, in nearby guarded buildings, their wives lived through a different kind of judgment. Hermann Göring's wife, Emmy, was staying in a secure house not far from the trial site. She was kept under constant watch by American military guards. Emmy repeatedly asked to visit her husband, but she was never allowed inside the prison. At times, she walked near the courthouse, trying to get close, wearing dark clothing and sunglasses to avoid being recognized by reporters and civilians. She wrote several letters to Göring, but most were either censored or never delivered. When Göring was sentenced to death on October 1st, 1946, Emmy was not informed directly. She only learned the news after he took cyanide in his cell the night before his scheduled execution on October 15th. Heinrich Himmler's wife, Margareta, was detained nearby and questioned several times during the trials. Though her husband had already committed suicide in May 1945, the Allies still considered her an important witness. She stayed in a military holding facility under American control in the Nuremberg region. Even as evidence of SS crimes was presented in court, she maintained that her husband had been a good man. In written statements, she said she had no knowledge of concentration camps or executions. Investigators found this hard to believe, given her close ties to SS families and the benefits she received during the war. After months of surveillance, she was released in early 1946, but threats from German civilians and anti-Nazi groups forced her to change her name and move away from public life. She avoided interviews and rarely spoke in public again. Neighbors rarely saw her outside. She never admitted to knowing about her husband's crimes, and no public statements were ever made in her name. She died in 1967 with no obituary and no official recognition. Margareta Speer had a slightly different experience. Her husband was one of the only defendants at the trial who admitted partial guilt. He accepted moral responsibility for using forced labor in arms factories. After he was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison, Margareta was allowed to meet him briefly in a secure visitor area. The meeting was short and formal. She was not allowed to bring her children or speak about politics. Once the sentence was confirmed, she returned home, where she had to raise the children alone while managing the constant stigma of being married to one of Hitler's closest advisors. Her movements were monitored by German authorities for several years after the trial, and she lived with limited means. After her husband's release in 1966, she supported his re-entry into society. Albert later wrote several books, but Margareta stayed out of the spotlight. She avoided public events and never spoke to the media. After Albert died in 1981, she continued living in Heidelberg. She passed away in 1987, remembered only by close family and a few friends. After the Nuremberg trials ended in 1946, the wives of top Nazi leaders faced a harsh new reality. Germany was divided, cities were in ruins, and everyday life was difficult, even for ordinary citizens. For the women tied to the Nazi elite, it was even worse. They were often rejected by neighbors, denied work, and treated with suspicion. Their reputations followed them everywhere. The old privileges were gone, and now they had to survive in a country that wanted nothing to do with its Nazi past. Lena Hedrick bought a farmhouse after she moved to the island of Fehmarn in northern Germany and opened a small guest house to earn money. Locals knew who she was, and many avoided her. Her children were often teased or excluded at school. Lena kept defending her husband's actions, saying he had only followed orders and had been loyal to Germany. In the 1950s, she gave interviews trying to reshape his image. She insisted he wasn't responsible for the Holocaust, even though he had helped organize the Wannsee Conference. She again gave several interviews in the 1960s and 70s, where she expressed no regrets for her husband's role in the Holocaust. She died in 1985, still denying any wrongdoing. Emmy Goering returned to Munich with no money, no home, and very few friends. The Allies had confiscated her family's belongings, including art, jewelry, and estates. Emmy tried to publish her memoirs in the early 1950s, but faced rejection from most publishers. She was known mostly as the Nazi actress, and carried that stigma wherever she went. Without financial support, she lived modestly in a small apartment. She rarely appeared in public and never gave full interviews. She died in Munich on June 8, 1973, with no public funeral. Ilse Hess had a very different reaction. She stayed loyal to her husband's memory and became active in far-right circles. In the early 1950s, she began writing for nationalist magazines, defending Hitler and claiming that Rudolf had tried to make peace with Britain. She believed he was wrongly imprisoned and demanded his release from Spandau. Despite being banned from political events, she continued her efforts until her death in 1995. Other wives faced similar struggles, poverty, rejection, and constant suspicion. Some changed their names. Some even moved to rural areas to avoid attention. None of them were ever part of public life again. For those tied to the Nazi leadership, post-war Germany offered no path back. Their husbands had led the country into disaster, and now they were left to carry the weight of that legacy alone. Most of their children chose not to follow the same path. Many changed their last names and moved abroad. Some moved to the United States, Canada, or South America to escape the past. A few wrote memoirs or gave interviews, but most stayed silent. The Nazi legacy had marked their families forever, and many chose to disconnect completely. By the end of the 20th century, nearly all the wives of the Nazi leadership were gone. Their deaths went mostly unnoticed. No monuments were built, no honors given, and no sympathy shown. Their lives had started with power and privilege, but ended in silence, shame, or denial. For Germany, they were part of a chapter that people wanted to close and never reopen.